Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 19th of January, 2024. Let's dive in. Excited to share today's episode, where we are going to be speaking with a fellow Special Operations veteran and current senior fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C., named E10 Brown. Ethan recently wrote a wonderful article for the Modern War Institute at West Point called The Ghost of GWOT Haunting the Military Recruiting Crisis, where he goes through and lays out what the effect of 20 years of continuous war has been on the American public and how that is impacting our current military's ability to train, man, and equip a fighting force as we move into this era of great power competition. Really enjoyed this conversation. We started off talking about the article and then got into a whole bunch of other fun topics involving America's role in the world, what the role of a citizen is in informing national policy, even getting into a couple of case studies involving Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, all that fun stuff that's going on in the world today. So with that, let's get to our conversation with Ethan Brown. Well, hey man, welcome to the podcast. How you doing this afternoon? Appreciate you hopping on real quick.
Yeah, appreciate you having me on, man. I've given most of the episodes of the show a listen. It's awesome what you're doing here with this project, and really appreciate you having me on.
Well, I appreciate that. You recently wrote an article for the Modern War Institute. Resonated with me. Happy to get into it in a short minute. But first, I got to start off with, you have successfully done something that I've failed to do in my special operations transition, in which you have successfully maintained a very unique hairstyle in your post-military life that my wife has absolutely forbidden me to even attempt. So perhaps you can talk to me while you're still running around with some weird-ass mohawk, a giant goatee with some borderline sideburns and some crazy-ass wrist tattoos. What's going on there, man?
Yeah, so I work for a policy think tank in D.C., and I'll go through my bio here momentarily. But to address the question, I work in D.C. for a nonpartisan policy think tank. I had a colleague make a comment a few years ago when I had started the goatee, and it was much longer than Viking braids and all that stuff. I think at the time I was playing Assassin's Creed Valhalla, so I was really into the Viking image. But my colleague pulled me to the side and he said, "Hey, Ethan, we love what you're doing here for the organization, but I got to ask, why the mohawk?" And I turned to him and was like, "Well, look, here's the thing. When you're working in D.C., everybody's generally the same. They got the comb over. They're working in an office. Maybe you haven't seen a lot of the sun in some time. And we bring principles to these national security events, and everything kind of blends together for those key individuals. But when they come to our organization, they may not even remember why they came to talk to us, but they're going to remember the big dude with the tattoos and the mohawk. So for me, it's branding and representation and making sure we leave a bit of a memory for the folks we bring in. So, I'm probably the only guy that walks around DC with a mohawk, which, branding, my guy.
Hey man, fair enough. I come from a long line of salesmen, and I was the one black sheep that went off and joined the army. So I definitely appreciate the marketing and branding aspect of what you're doing, but you're doing great stuff down there in DC, and being remembered is almost more important than anything else you do in the meeting, for sure.
Right. I mean, everybody's constantly swapping business cards, right? So after a while, you get a collection of them, and none of them stand out. So you're always trying to stand out when you've got a platform and in knowledge to share.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the article that you recently wrote, because I reached out to you because you caught my attention with the piece that you wrote for the Modern War Institute, which was actually, I checked out some of your citations and everything else. It was very well researched, very well cited, and actually very insightful for a broader theme. You mentioned that you tied a few things together. There's an issue with recruitment across the Department of Defense, specifically in the Army, and you tied that issue in with a broader, you phrase it as societal fatigue with the military following the global war on terror. It resonated very deeply with me. I grew up with the global war on terror. 9/11 happened when I was in middle school. I went off and joined the Army, became Special Forces. I was one of the last guys in Afghanistan. You also worked in Special Operations. You know the big rocks I'm going to hint at here in a minute. But there's the old phrase that, war is the continuation of politics by other means, by this old dead Prussian named Clausewitz that we all like to quote. And politics is nothing but political will. So you charted in your article a very interesting narrative about how we've been worn out on political will to the point where nobody even wants to engage in military activity. And the corollary to that is that we're degrading our ability to actually engage in meaningful conversations about what military force should be in support of Americans' national security objectives. So that's my take on your article and all the things that surrounded it. But could you explain to the audience real quick your background in special operations? And then we'll get into the actual piece that you wrote for the Modern War Institute.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I spent 11 years in the Air Force as a special operations JTAC. So I was the guy, the lone Air Force operator who would embed with joint special operations teams. And I controlled close air support. I was qualified and certified to talk to aircraft on a radio and call in airstrikes and manage ISR platforms in order to enable the ground force commander's priorities and scheme of maneuver. I know you've got the SF background. Unfortunately, I never got the chance to work much with SF. I spent most of my Air Force career direct support to the 75th Ranger Regiment. So I do come from that, special operations background, got exposure to the much of the U.S. SOCOM inventory. There was 5 combat deployments across Afghanistan and other locations. I did, as I said, 11 years. 2019, I made the decision. I wanted to get into the policy community to discuss national security and defense strategy and policy. So I took advantage of the Air Force's Career Skills Program, also known as the SkillBridge program. Sent my resume across Capitol Hill to all of the nonpartisan think tanks. Ended up taking an internship or fellowship. It was kind of this gray amoebus new thing they were trying with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, who I remain embedded with and work for as a senior fellow for national security and defense strategy. Now, what I do at the CSPC is I conduct research on the military affairs, military readiness, technology, future warfighting concepts, and I write for a variety of publications, including Task and Purpose, War on the Rocks, the Diplomatic Courier, and as you mentioned, I've written several pieces for the Modern War Institute at West Point. Everything very forward-looking as far as how our military can and should engage in future operations. And I noticed just this morning, your newest episode about special operations in great power competition. Haven't had a chance to listen, but definitely looking forward to that. So that's my background. Former tactical operator, now moved into the policy circles, and now we can jump into the ghosts of GWOT haunting the military recruiting crisis, which is the title of this article we're discussing today. Yeah. So as you mentioned, kind of the key points, the opening graph or the lead of this article is the societal fatigue. So how I'd like to quantify that for the listeners is when our elected leaders, our policymakers go into a new conflict. We can look at crises, December 7th, 1941, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, or indeed September 11th, 2001. And after our sovereignty or a direct threat to our security is put at risk, the public support for our policymakers to begin those military operations, it shoots up exponentially, right? Nothing is going to unify the American people more than a crisis. And we saw that with September 11th. The public The public faith in our institutions was high because we faced a crisis which required the allocation of national resources and power to address what was a misunderstood threat, and I defend it remained misunderstood for the entirety of the post 9/11 wars. But the analogy I like to use for this, and you're a finance guy now, right? Having left military service and now you work in the financial industry.
Well, I work in corporate America in a variety of
Okay.
roles. But yeah,
Gotcha.
finance is
Yeah.
a big part of what I do now.
Of course, yeah. And so I think you'll appreciate this analogy, and I could have used it in the article, of course, but imagine that public support, what I like to call social capital. It's very sort of vague amoeba's term, but it's almost like a credit card that our elected leaders can swipe in the war account, right? Like can swipe that card, spend it on those national resources to address those threats. At the beginning of the post 9/11 wars, at the time it was still called the Global War on Terror, our leaders could swipe that card left and right. And we went into Afghanistan with a very small footprint of special operations forces, a concentration of air power capabilities, and we toppled a Taliban regime and absolutely fractured Al-Qaeda, which was the prevalent threat and source of the 9/11 attacks. So when we did that, man, that social capital just skyrocketed again because we had those tangible effects on the ground using our national resources, using our military power to deter a threat, to defeat an adversary. But then 2003 happened, and we had a wayward misadventure into Iraq, which was misinformed based on bad intelligence and policy adapting, or intelligence adapting to determined policy to invade another country. And that began this 20-year quagmire of we achieved tactical success on the ground, but it did not evolve into a long-term, what is the end state and what are the ways and means of getting there? So where we had two distinct wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and we had successes early on, eventually we ran out of those successes that the American people could comprehend and understand to pay back into that social capital account. But that card that was being swiped over and over, drawing from that public goodwill, I mean, we overdrafted that account after 20 years. And that I defend is what I've called the ghost of GWOT, is 20 years of wayward strategy and flawed policy. And the American people, they don't have the faith in the military as an institution following that, which is a direct cause or direct source of this military recruiting crisis.
Yeah. Well, let's follow up on that with a focus on America internally real quick, because I've got some other follow-up questions about America externally and some carryovers there. But so America internally, with this lack of faith, this social fatigue that you've identified in your article, they'll be linked in the show notes for folks who want to go check it out. And I encourage folks to please do so. It's open source. It's very, very insightful, much better than anything that anyone's going to get on cable news or the New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal. Anyway, what side effects after 20 years, as far as our ability to train, maintain, man, and equip the current force for our geopolitical objectives, have you observed with America's seeming lack of faith in the military as an institution? Because I can remember back to, so I was in high school from, early 2000s to mid 2000s. And it was, the America where the military is the most highly credited institution in America. We can do no wrong. We're doing everything right. It's everyone else that's messed up. We have unlimited faith and confidence. I'm sure you've had leaders sat down and share those stats with you while you're during your time in service, and I certainly had them share them with me. What are the follow-on effects? What's the hangover of this blank check that seemed to skid the wheels of American geopolitics as we continue to pursue these adventures in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and then follow on in Syria and other places around the world?
Yeah. So the difficulty and the reason I've actually had the concept for this particular article for about 5 years, and I only just recently wrote it back in November, December. It's very hard to to qualify and quantify exactly what this hangover is that I've tried to define. And that's a problem when you're having a policy discussion, because if there is a tangible problem with strategy or policy, and you can define that with metrics, then you can make that argument in a policy discussion, and an elected leader or a strategic leader can say, okay, do we align financial resources? Do we align human capital? Do we change a policy? Right? But when we're talking about this societal fatigue and redressing it, I mean, we're essentially trying to boil an ocean, right? How do we restore faith in an institution? But the side effects of that, and some of the things I pointed out in the article with links to support the research, is there are myriad smaller issues as a younger generation of Americans are considering military service, which is the lack of competitive pay with private industry. There are abysmal substandard living conditions that junior enlisted and junior officers are dealing with across multiple bases, domestically and overseas. There is the discussion of healthcare for both active duty and veterans, and we could take any one of these subtopics and it would populate an entire podcast episode, right? As we're trying to pull back the layers. Furthermore, and this one is one that I sort of take issue with, which was actually sort of the impetus for this article, which is the concept of woke ideologies permeating professional military education. Now, for me, I did a great deal of investigation with folks in my network. I maintain contacts across U.S. SOCOM and the Air Force and Army writ large. And it's always, when this topic of woke ideology eroding the military as an institution, you never talk with somebody who actually has to be sat down and given whatever it's always a boogeyman threat, right? Or as I like to define it, it's the REO Speedwagon of, I heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from a friend that they had to sit through this Marxist indoctrination. And without naming any media platforms, but modern media platforms are just partisan talking platforms. That's all they are. So on one side of our political spectrum, that sort of concept, woke ideology eroding the military, exists very heavily on one end of the spectrum. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's the debate about, say, extremist ideologies permeating the military. And the reality is, sure, there's probably a fraction of a percent of service members who may harbor some extremist ideologies. I mean, we're pulling candidates from the entire depth of the American society, right? So yeah, of course you have to assume that there's a very small percentage of people who probably come from a desultory background that you wouldn't want in the ranks. But we've made boogeymen out of both of these things. So that's one of those side effects. And it's not just the military. It's at a much broader societal level where everything, I mean, can you go to your Thanksgiving family dinner without worrying about a political discussion coming up and the discord it creates? I mean, frankly, you can't. That's the society we live in here in the United States. And I think that ties into a deeper issue in terms of trying to address the problem, which again, how do we fix a lack of faith in the military as an institution that's boiling the ocean? But I think a major component to that is the fact that we live in an age of disinformation. We have access to more data. I'm holding up my phone in my hand as we're recording this video. These little devices in our hands give us access to all the information in human history. But we're still adapting as a society to the sheer volume of information. The sheer volume of information that we're absorbing. So our adversaries, if we're going to frame the recruiting crisis into a national security issue, our strategic competitors, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, they're using disinformation as a shaping operation at all times. And the great thing for them is they don't need to see tangible effects of their disinformation. In the same way, as I mentioned earlier, when we began the post 9/11 wars, American citizens could turn on their TV and see bombs falling on Saddam Hussein's military and toppling his regime. Those were tangible effects that could be perceived and appreciated. But for our adversaries in 2024, they can continue with the disinformation campaigns that erode faith in our institutions, such as the military, such as our elected leaders, education institutions, what have you, for far less than it costs to stage a war. And they don't necessarily care what the effects are. They just care that they're getting effects. If we take this back to the 2016 and 2020 elections, I would argue that Moscow didn't necessarily care who won the election in 2016. What they cared about was that Americans, at least a certain percentage of them, don't believe in the results of that election. And we can point to the director of national intelligence testified before Congress about the 2016 election, saying, yes, absolutely, it was interfered with. Now, it wasn't suggested during that testimony that the results were the election results were because a foreign adversary wanted them to turn out that specific way. That's not necessary for this type of disinformation that we're facing as a society. All they needed to do, our adversaries, is achieve some kind of effects, right? So we're talking about side effects to the society we're in now with this recruiting crisis. A whole generation of young Americans are getting their news from TikTok, from scrolling through feeds. They get 10-second blurbs of analyses, opinions, and none of it may even be research-based, but there's a recent example of a senator withholding military promotions. And for you and I, guys who came from a military service, we understand these are general level officers. These are 30-year service members who their careers are already set. It's not a huge risk for them to be suspended for promotions because of congressional, acknowledgement. But if you're 17 or 18 years old and you're thinking to yourself, well, I want to join the Army, and so you get on your phone and you're trying to find military news, military officer promotions being withheld due to a partisan issue, right? How's that going to impact that 17 or 18-year-old who doesn't understand the context of the complexity of officer versus enlisted promotions, what have you? So that, just off the top of my head, I mean, those are some of the side effects of what this lack of faith or loss of faith is having on the military recruiting crisis.
Yeah. So there's like 10,000 great threads to pull on there. Let me start exploring it from this angle, because what you're getting at really is there's this idea in international politics, international relations, the scholarly literature governing the interaction of states, that the nation state is the primary actor in the international system. It's like, okay, fair enough. What is the nation state? It's a country, but there's a nation and there's a state. And so what's the nation versus the state? Okay, cool story. So we have the nation as a group of people with a combined set of values who are willing to organize, accept sacrifice, and pursue common objectives together and bear the burden of those consequences. And then we have states, which are geographic territories that those nations occupy, that somewhat govern from a practical perspective what their sovereignty extends to. There's a great book called This Kind of War that talks about the history of the Korean War, which is the first war that we fought post-World War II. And in the post-World War II era, we get into this, hey, America is the only global superpower anymore. We've got nukes somebody else does. Europe's wiped out. We have an industrial base. We're basically going to underwrite the reconstruction of Europe and then go into this whole Cold War era where we try to redefine the nature of human existence on planet Earth. We get to Francis Fukuyama, the end of history. Like, this gets really broad really fast. But everything that you just ran through really dives into what is the nature of a nation and what's the relationship between the nation and the state that represents them on the international stage. Those are very deep questions, and they're questions that citizens should absolutely be considering. So, what do you think, based off your recent research, what did we gain and what did we lose as an American nation pursuing a geopolitical goal as a state abroad between 2001 and 2003, and then fast forward 20 years later? Because the old cliche is the military went to war and America went to the mall. Like, we almost became victims of our own catastrophic success, where we hung out as a nation state in the global war on terror, fucking around, dropping bombs, doing raids, writing checks for gas stations that were never going to get built, paying off local warlords. And we had so much excess in our domestic system that we didn't pay attention to what we were doing abroad, which is fine from an imperial standpoint. But I know I have friends, and I'm sure that you have friends that are currently 6 feet under the ground as a result, in one way or the other, of that sort of exhibitionism. So what would you tell the American public after 20 years of the global war on terror about how they should view their role in the international system, their role as citizens, and then also what's America's role as a nation state in the global order?
Oh,
Yep.
What we learned from the war on terror. I'll take a brief aside here to kind of promote my forthcoming book. It's called Visual Friendly's Tally Target. It's actually a trilogy. The first book will be coming out here in a few months. It's a history of close air support and forward air controllers in the war on terror. I interviewed over 100 individuals as I've built out this anthology. And it's both an examination of my former career in the Air Force, but as a policy guy, it necessarily includes a critique and review of our grand strategy over the course of our longest war. So what we learned. There's a salient point that my former team sergeant, who was on the Extortion 17 recovery mission in 2011, and the way he put it, when we're talking about going into this new kind of war with an adversary that didn't wear a uniform, that we did not understand, and when I say we did not understand, I mean our strategists, our policymakers, our leaders. He says, look, man, I don't think we lost the war, the global war on terror. Because if you look at the battlefield metrics, and pardon my language, but we whooped that ass, right? Of course, we had, as you mentioned, we had our friends that you and I have put in the ground. But comparatively, it was a one-sided affair. We had every military and tactical advantage imaginable. We did not fail to win. We did not lose the war as a military, as a war-fighting tool. But the U.S. military is not a nation-building enterprise. And what was expected of the U.S. military was to implement, export some kind of Jeffersonian democracy to places around the world whose very culture stands anathema to the idea of representative government, individual liberties. Given time, perhaps Afghanistan could have ultimately emerged into some form of a liberal democracy. But in order to do that, and as I told, it was General Scott Miller in 2019, I had a chance to have a conversation with him. I talked with a lot of senior leaders during my time overseas. And I said, look, if we want to succeed in Afghanistan, we have to do the same thing we did in Germany and Japan and Korea, and we need to stay here for 100 years. We need to stay here until generations have passed where they can determine their own version of the democracy that we hold so dear. It requires a change in culture, and that's a kind of commitment that I guess in the 21st century is difficult for the Americans who went to the mall to fully wrap their heads around. And maybe that's the effect, victims of our own success, is that we went into Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003 and absolutely cleaned the table off, right? But then there was no concept of what do we do next? The concept did not come from our elected leaders with a long-term strategy and a long-term objective and policy shaped to achieve those objectives. So what we learned from this war is we can still go toe-to-toe with anybody on the planet in terms of military confrontation. What we have not figured out how to do, and what we should take away from this 20-year war, is that we don't necessarily know how to build a nation, although we figured out one method, which is staying there generation to generation. And we're still in South Korea. We're still in Germany. We're still in Japan. We still have those partnerships from countries that were once our adversaries. But I think what the American people, if I was to have this platform to talk to the Americans as we're, and we're still trying to keep this relatively pigeonholed into the topic of the recruiting crisis. And as I mentioned before, I think disinformation is a huge part of that in this new arena of strategic competition. I think the American people need to take more responsibility for determining when they're being manipulated by this kind of disinformation. Because if you can get two individuals sitting down, even those who are diametrically opposed to one another, philosophically opposed, they can find common ground. But when we bring in entire groups of people, that groupthink always takes over. And we've done such a poor job emerging from this now confrontational or controversial war where we had no political long-term objectives. And you just have the parties divided on we should have stayed longer, we should have gotten out before, it was an unjust war. There's all these different partisan talking points about the war. And I think the lesson that the American people should take from that is we have to do a better job of recognizing where we had shortcomings. And now moving forward, we have to recognize how we can still be undermined on the international stage, because the United States is still in the pole position for liberal democracy, but this lack of faith in our institutions is eroding our perception across the world.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into then the role of the American citizen, because I would absolutely agree with you that there's a disconnect between the American citizenry and the leaders in the institutions that we currently have that represent them abroad, and there's a mismatch in goals, objectives, results, however you want to break it down. And there's 1,000 rabbit holes there to dive into, and perhaps we should come back and dive into some of them. I'm sure we'd have some fun things to talk about. But let's pick the most controversial topic of the day and dive into it. You ready?
Oh, yeah.
All right, let's go. So right now, we have the Israeli war in Gaza against Hamas. And there's calls for a ceasefire, and there's calls for genocide allegations in the International Court of Justice of the UN and all sorts of things. And there's calls for wiping out Hamas. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that you and I probably agree the only time you should negotiate with terrorists is when you're negotiating where to dump the bodies after the deed is done. But there does seem to be some blowback as far as America's support for Israel and the provision of support, intelligence, munitions, everything else. So what would, in your opinion, be a mature conversation amongst American citizens about what the nature of American support for Israel should be in Gaza against Hezbollah? Because Hezbollah, you couldn't write a better narrative about some people that just deserve to die. I mean, they've on October 7th, they writ it themselves. Like, it's not hard to justify that. But from a national security standpoint, with a populace that's worn out, has societal fatigue, as you put it, from the global war on terror, what realistically should we expect from the American public for support in this fight against Hamas?
So Hamas presents the same challenge that we face in the war on terror, is that they are a non-state actor, state-sponsored, admittedly, and we all know this. But they are a non-state actor, which makes some of those rules of engagement so challenging when you're looking at things from a tactical perspective. In a sovereign nation like Israel, and they're dealing with the complexity of issues of having Palestine there, and we spend years talking about what is a two-state solution, or how do we negotiate this sharing of territory. It's such a quagmire of issues. But what Americans should consider, and this can just as easily be applied to aid we send to Ukraine as well, is if we're going to support Israel, or if there's an argument against supporting Israel in fighting a terror organization, is it worth allowing malicious actors in the region, such as Iran, to gain outsized influence with a partner with whom we work? And yes, if there's allegations, that means there must be some shred of truth when it comes to, say, civilian casualties or abuses during combat. So we have to recognize that war is a dirty business, for one thing. No matter how ethical you try to be, it's one group of people engaging in violent activities against another group of people, and tragically, civilians get caught up in the middle. That is the unique power of non-state organizations such as terror groups to use that fear to achieve their political or ideological outcomes. But is it worth the United States pulling out of a region? And you mentioned Francis Fukuyama's end of history concept earlier in the podcast. So I'd like to take a quick sidebar here and point out that I believe it was Huntington at that same time who argued, no, this is not the victory of liberal democracy. In the future, we will see regionalization and tribal identities and nationalist identities becoming the main actors in international relations theory. And 40 years after Fukuyama and Huntington presented their cases, look who turned out to be a little more correct. We are seeing the regionalization of politics. We're seeing the regionalization of national security strategies by multiple key actors. We live in a highly multipolar world, and those non-state entities such as Hamas, what remains of the Islamic State, what remains of Al-Qaeda, they are key actors in this arena in which we engage. So is it worth it for us, the Americans, to say we shouldn't be supporting Israel or Ukraine or whoever against malicious actors? No. Do those partners that we engage with security aid, with financial support, should they be held accountable for their missteps in warfare? Of course. If they want to be legitimate actors in the grand arena, they need to be held accountable for their actions, just as we are, for the most part, right? So yeah, it's a quagmire. There's rabbit holes all across the discussion you and I are having on this particular subtopic. But I mean, it's simply a question of, do we allow these malicious actors abroad to have their way because they're willing to engage in activities that we consider to be repugnant?
Yeah. Okay. All right, let me try to do this. I'm excited now. Okay. Because you brought up Huntington versus Fukuyama. So now I'm excited. It's like, all right, okay.
My undergrad degree was in international relations, and I'm currently going to Johns Hopkins for global security studies. So we can nerd out on this as much as you'd like.
Well, shoot, this is a rabbit hole, but I'm not going to walk away from it. We gotta dive into this real quick for 5 minutes. Okay, let's do it. So there's an argument out there in the international relations literature and amongst policy circles that we currently live in a state of liberal hegemony. That is that the entire liberal versus realist literature only exists because America is the unipolar, dominant, hegemonic force in the system. We define the rules, rule-based international order. Like every major global institution only exists because America backed it post-World War II in some way or another. And because of that, and only because of that, the entire liberal neoliberal consensus has existed as far as, international law is actually legitimate and we can all get along and states can cooperate outside of violence and this, that, and the other thing. What are your thoughts on the credibility of international law, international humanitarian law? And if you were like, say, you are Ukraine or you are Israel or you are Russia, what would you do to support your own interests in this current global world order where America appears to be pulling back from its traditional role and we'll define traditional starting as in 1945 post-World War II. So going back to 1945, where America has guaranteed freedom of maneuver across the seas for global trade and everything else. If you're a minor actor with a major role, how do you play your part in this system? If you're Israel, if you're Ukraine, if you're Russia. Pick your case study and go for it.
Right. Yeah. Well, I actually, when Russia began their illegal invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. I had written an article for the Diplomatic Courier, and I'm paraphrasing the title because I'm drawing a blank, but I can send you the link for it if you want to include it. It's basically I address the limitations of liberalism in crisis.
Yep.
When we, the liberal international rules-based order, devise our grand strategy, it is inherently short-term focused. What I mean by that is in the United States, we turn over an administration every 4 years. Even if you have back-to-back, re-elected presidencies, there is an evolution of those policy priorities for that administration. So really, you could say we turn over our executive leadership every 8 years. And our congressional leadership is a bit of a different discussion, but in the eyes of the world, they look at the U.S. president as the face of American policy, and in terms of international policy and national security, rightly so. The limitations of the international order is that we turn over our elected leaders on a consistent basis. We are engaged in competition with autocrats, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, who they are there until they physically can no longer hold the seat. And then we can presume another autocrat would take their place. So the question of what can actors do in terms of legitimizing themselves as we engage in this international arena is really tough for those of us on the liberal rules-based order side who recognize that cooperation and mutual collaboration is the best way to move the human species forward and hopefully not destroy the atmosphere with, a nuclear fallout of some sort if things escalate to their penultimate worst. So how do we legitimize those institutions with such high political turnover? It comes back to that faith in our institutions and our citizenry taking a responsible role in participation and not getting sucked into, and I keep coming back to a key point here, almost unintentionally, of recognizing the disinformation that is running rampant around the world. Those maybe illegitimate's the wrong word, but those authoritarian actors in the international arena with whom we are in competition, the state structure that they have within the, as you said, the quote nation state, well, the state controls the nation. They control the information. I mean, look at how China's locked down their internet access for, decades now. Same thing in Russia. The disinformation is not just malicious actors trying to undermine the liberal order's nation-state relationship. It is also to repress their own people because just as we saw at the end of the Cold War, Soviet leaders recognized they could never compete with the United States once a light was shined on their system, which required the control of information. Mm-hmm. So what can we do to legitimize our position, and what would authoritarian actors do to attempt to legitimize their position? It is the control of information, who reads it, and how it becomes interpreted by the citizenry of a given nation state. An example that I'm just pulling this off the cuff here, I can go on to X, formerly known as Twitter, and I follow legitimate institutions, news publications, leading experts in academia and whatnot. But despite me trying to control the algorithm of a social media app, I still get wackadoodles who are trying to promote these crazy conspiracy notions about global cabals and things that might feed into the current crisis. And it's like, how does this crazy personality have 100,000 followers on Twitter, and I'm struggling to crack 1,000 after I've established myself as an expert in a given field? It's because people become addicted to the sensationalism because it reads well on the 15-second scrolling cycle. So our legitimacy requires that our citizens take responsibility for this information, which is the age that we live in, right? So if you're a malicious actor, you want to control that information. If we're a legitimate actor, we want to promote the right kind of information. And how do we determine what the right kind of information is? Again, we would be trying to boil the ocean by answering that question, but a lot of it comes back to getting away from our partisan divides as a country and figuring out more that we have in common rather than more that separates or distinguishes us from one another.
So let's pick at this thread real quick, because you brought up a bunch of very interesting things there. One of the things that you brought up was, the world's better when we all work together, essentially. If the information that's going to different citizens across the world is valid and all that sort of thing. But with that, is it even possible for nation states to cooperate if there isn't one big badass on the block, like American hegemonic military force, to force them to cooperate? And so do American citizens have an extra obligation as participants in the international system to police their own political discourse and maintain a certain military authority? Like, is everything that we're discussing right here just a convenience of an American-dominated global world order? Or do we abandon globalization and, friendshore, inshore all of our manufacturing and production and, just treat this as a transactional relationship between the stars and stripes and everybody else on the planet?
Well, you used an expression there that is really interesting and I think sort of addresses the problem. Yes, the United States, we are the big one on the block, right? I mean, we're still, I'm a little partial, and as I suspect you are as well, we're still the best country on earth to live in, right? Do we have our problems?
Anything else so far?
No, of course not. Do we have our problems? Yes, of course we do. We have societal issues. We have need for justice reform. We have need for addressing some of the things that divide us as a nation. But you wouldn't trade being an American citizen for just about anywhere else on the planet, right? With that comes maybe not the obligation or the assumed obligation, but the responsibility as an American to understand what we're doing and how our actions impact the world. I would almost liken it to the polemark position going back to ancient Rome and Greece, where when a city-state was under threat, they would suspend, the normal political activities in crises so that one military leader could manage that danger. Well, the United States, for all intents and purposes, is the polemark of the liberal order. We hold that bastion of liberty and democracy. There's I believe, a statue in New York City's harbor that's supposed to be, holding up that torch of freedom and liberty. And that's the image that we project to the world, right? So maybe it's not, we have to go be the ones that set the standard and establish what the rules are because we're the biggest and the baddest, but it's our responsibility to do our damnedest to get as many people under that light of liberty as possible. And we do so by being legitimate. We do so by being credible, by holding ourselves accountable for our shortcomings, by recognizing that we are manipulated by things we don't understand in this emerging era of strategic competition. And we do so by ensuring that the political processes are legitimate and credible and that people participate in those processes. I think a lot of Americans, they treat politics as a sporting event, right? The next election is always the most important of our lifetime, right? And whether, the outcome is no different than, dang it, my team lost the Super Bowl. And I'm a Patriots fan, so I'm used to winning lots of Super Bowls, right? But, I can't necessarily point to any correlation in the political election process where it's like, yeah, my team, this, that, and the other thing, right? Because there's always the quote losing side. And one of the best analogies I heard on this particular topic about our political processes is wanting the newly elected president to fail because you're on the side that lost is kind of like hoping the pilot of the plane you're flying in crashes.
Yeah.
We should not be rooting against the person that the majority of Americans gave the penultimate responsibility to. Can we criticize when they take actions that we deem unethical? Yes, that's the whole point of our constitutional democracy. But treating our politics like it's a sporting event and hating on the other team because they beat us in the Super Bowl, that's not the answer either, right? And going back to this grand arena of competition, we have to take responsibility for the fact that we remain the pole mark of liberal democracy and liberal thought.
Yeah. Okay. So two-part question, and then we're going to wrap. First one's going to be easy. Second one's going to be fun. So first part of the question, and I got lots of follow-ups that I'm hoping we can do in another podcast episode. First part of the question is, what's the current name of the think tank that you're working for right now?
So that is the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. It is a nonpartisan think tank commissioned back in the 50s at the behest of President Eisenhower to address the responsible roles and responsibilities of the executive and the congressional branches.
Excellent. Second part of the question. As a member of that, very well-esteemed and prestigious institution with your excellent background in foreign policy and national security, all jokes there and inside implied, what's your confidence level right now that the current slate of congressional leadership and executive level leadership on both parties is actually up to the task of evaluating these things appropriately and coming up with measured policy recommendations?
I don't know that I can necessarily directly answer that question, but what I will say is, again, Americans necessarily must take more responsibility in their political activities. And what I would argue most Americans don't understand is just how complex the body within Washington, D.C. and the number of people addressing various issues. I don't think Americans understand how complex that is. I can speak from the think tank side of things, right? And for me, writing on military policy and defense strategy, this is a very important topic. We can all generally agree on that. But it's one topic across tens of thousands that come across our elected leaders' desks on a daily basis when they're not in recess. And I don't think Americans fully appreciate the sheer volume of issues that are constantly presented to our elected leaders, who most of them, I would argue, are doing their level best to represent their constituents and address as many of these issues as possible. And I would point to another podcast, a conversation between filmmaker Sebastian Junger, and I believe it was on the Joe Rogan podcast. It was after his book, Freedom, came out a couple years ago.
Great book.
Fantastic book. I absolutely loved it. It's in fact influenced some outdoor activities I'm doing with my young boys, as far as us getting some backpacks on and just going out and getting lost a little bit. So strongly recommend to the listeners that they read Sebastian Junger's Freedom. But Junger is having this conversation about political discourse. And this goes back to how we perceive our elected leaders too, right? And my faith in those congressional and executive leaders. Junger said, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't go into a conversation immediately assuming this other person is wrong or has malicious intent. Even if they're maybe philosophically or politically opposed to me, I go into every conversation assuming they're doing what they believe is the best thing for the biggest number of people. And in our discussion here, that means elected leaders and their constituents. So I still have faith in our congressional body, even though it has myriad issues. I still have faith in the institution of the presidency and that institution being held accountable by our congressional leaders. There are, however, actors within our Congress who maybe operate at both of the fringier edges of the political spectrum, and those are the ones who just happen to get the most screen time, which for an impressionable generation of Americans who live on that 15-second scrolling cycle, that's all they see. They don't understand, and this younger generation, not understanding the military but considering service, younger generation developing as soon-to-be voters. They don't understand how many issues really swirl around in Washington, D.C. that our elected leaders do take seriously and are doing their level best to get through those as best as they can.
Okay. Well, the cynic in me would take a very different take on that, but the American in me appreciates your optimism and the work that you're doing to try to right this ship. Okay. Well, I think we've reached a good point to wrap on this one particular topic, but I do hope we can come back again and deep dive some of the interesting things that popped up during this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the topic of the recruiting crisis, this one commentary is not the end of my research on this issue. There's more forthcoming, and it hopefully will address the not just the so what, but what's the path ahead. It's one thing to address a problem, and this kind of runs rampant through the think tank industry, if you will, of everybody's really good at defining what the problems are. The struggle is in charting a course forward. So future articles will hopefully point to some of the means by which we can redress that loss of faith and how it can be brought back to the American people and the institutions affected.
Okay. Well, looking forward to seeing the next piece you publish, and I'll definitely include a link to your current article in the show notes. But Ethan, want to thank you for coming on today and sharing your insights. It's really been a pleasure to have you on, and appreciate everything that you've done in uniform and everything you're doing in your post-uniform life to try to make America a better place for everybody.
It's a pleasure, Scott. Looking forward to the next episode.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in today. If you liked what you heard, please follow the podcast and share with your friends, and even consider going to the support the show link in the episode description. Thank you, and I'll see you all next time.